Now time to discuss your money. Now, soon after the Supreme Court ruled on the presidential election petition, the bulls took a plunge that saw losses leading to billions of shillings. This was the tipping point of what had been a string of dip in the economy following the general election. Well, in studio to help us appreciate the extent of the effect the election had on the economy is Ken Gishinga, Chief Economist at Mentoria Consulting. Welcome to Morning Express. So many expected that the economy would take a hit during the August 8th general elections, but we had another shocker decision by the Supreme Court, and soon after the Chief Justice read out that ruling, I understand there was a big change in the stock market within the first 10 minutes, but many Kenyans did not quite understand what that change meant. Take us through the events as soon as the Chief Justice read that ruling.
Thanks and good morning. What happened on Friday, the Supreme Court ruling on Friday sent a major shockwaves to both the domestic markets and the international markets. It was something that was historical. It was something that was unprecedented, not just on the African continent, but globally. I believe only Ukraine, Austria, and the Maldives have ever pulled off such a feat. So naturally, what happens among investors when you get into very uncharted waters, what happens is people start getting a bit anxious, and that's what we saw. 92 billion shillings was wiped out from the stock exchange in the first day. I mean, they even had to sort of pause trading because there was a lot of negative activity. The shilling, too, started weakening, but I think we saw some stability on the shilling. But let me tell you, the stock market is highly invested by foreign investors. About 75% of investors in the stock exchange are foreigners. So what we saw is the international investors were pulling out, but interestingly enough, local investors were buying, but only 25% of the market, so they couldn't really have a major impact on the market. But that said, I think things are beginning to stabilize now. I think people have said that the Supreme Court has spoken, and people are sort of now trying to grapple with what does it mean for the short term and the long term for the country.
Right, and of course that's what every Kenyan wants to know. So whatever is happening in the stock market, how is it going to affect the common mwananchi, especially in terms of access to capital for business people? Right.
I mean, unfortunately, I'd say the stock market is still highly dominated by foreign investors, and the Kenyan investors who participate, that 25%, it's normally the more wealthier, the more informed segment of the population. So I think some of my misgivings have been that we've not had enough effort on how to bring the common Wanjiko, the common Mwananchi on the ground to understand the stock market, to understand what equities are. That's one reason. Another reason is Kenyans have huge appetite for land investments.
Right. And
that's been by far the most popular asset class for most local Kenyan investors. So to a lot of people talking about the stock market still, it's still a very, very distant conversation. But that's changing. I think a lot of people are becoming more informed. A lot of people are becoming more aware. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more participation
as we go along. And even before we get to how this is going to affect the person in the ground, we've had several credit rating agencies also have their say following that Supreme Court decision. One of them, Moody's agency here, says that that court ruling by the Supreme Court could have a negative credit, or a credit negative for the country, with the current credit rating standing at B+. What does that, first of all, mean for the country?
You have to look at these things from two perspectives, the short term and the long term. The short term perspective is, you're right, people are very anxious about what's going to happen in the next 60 days. We hear we're going to have elections on October 17th. So it could be negative in the short term, but I believe in the long term, a lot of people will look at this as a country that has independent institutions. Whether you like the judgments or not, we have a country that has institutions that sometimes can go against the executive.
Right.
So to a lot of investors, that's very attractive in terms of constitutionalism. So I think in the long term, it's going to be a very attractive thing. But you're right, in the short run, it's going to be very messy because we've never been here before.
Right, so let's focus on how this is likely to impact the greater East African region, because Kenya is, the star economy of the East African region, so to speak. We are the biggest exporters of black tea globally. And as it stands, GDP is mostly dependent on agriculture and to a small extent also tourism, two industries which are subject to great changes in the wake of this election. How is the country's economy likely to recover from this, considering when it comes to agriculture, we are just recovering from a drought? The World Bank estimates that GDP reduces by about 0.6 percentage points in drought years. Right. So already we're having a blow dealt there. Tourism isn't doing so well. So what options or solutions can the country look to?
You're right. I think our economic policy needs to be adjusted a bit. But I don't think we should lose focus that Kenya is the poster child of the East African economy.
Right.
And there's a reason for that. We have the most diversified economy in the region, more than Tanzania, more than Uganda. If you look at our human capital, you can't compare that to the region in terms of Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania. So you have a highly educated young labor force. So none of these things are going to change in the next 2 months, whether there's an election or not. All those fundamentals are in place, and Kenya is still going to be the place for investors to come in. Right. That said, uncertainty sometimes makes investors think twice. So if somebody was thinking of putting up maybe a factory, maybe in Kenya, and so things are a bit jittery, they could easily choose Tanzania. But net, I think what investors love to see in a country is what we call rule of law, what we call predictability. If I put my money in there, I'm sure in the next 5 years I'll get my returns. Right. And the best indicator for that is having a strong constitution. So I think what happened on Friday, despite the debate on the quality of the judgment, the fact that an institution can actually give a ruling that's adverse to the executive, to a lot of investors, that shows maturity of institutions. So I still think a lot of East African countries and a lot of African countries will be looking to Kenya in terms of leadership, in terms of jurisprudence, in terms of institutions. So I think it's a very attractive thing. But I think a lot of people are focused on what happened in the last few days. Right. You know, the bloodbath in the stock market, the shilling, real estate is not doing very well. But I think sometimes we lose sight of the long-term things, and I think that's where the real prize is. Are
we likely to have any impact on the investors, any further impact on the investors owing to the rate of growth of the country right now? Because initially, I understand that IMF had predicted or projected the country's growth to be about 6%. Right. I understand National Treasury, on the other hand, is about at 5.7%. But as it stands, I believe as of April, that was at 4.7%, owing to the drought situation in the country. Is that likely to affect investor reception in the country as well?
No, absolutely it will affect, because it becomes much harder to plan businesses. What investors hate is uncertainty. So it's much harder now to plan your business in terms of strategy, laying out a strategy. So in that sense, it will affect growth prospects for 2017. We might just be at 5%, barely. But I think if you think about it globally, where most countries are growing at below 1%, 5% is still a very attractive prospect. It's not the 10 double digits that we hoped back in 2013 when the Jubilee administration came in. But if you really think about it, the top growing economies are growing at between 5 to 7%. So we are still within the upper tier of growth prospects. But you're right, drought, the credit, the law that hampered credit provisions last year to 14%. All those things have had a major damage on the economy.
Let's focus on that for a moment, because of all the uncertainties within the stock market and the trading of the shilling. I understand that 7 out of 11 lenders in the country have also had their shares reduced in the market. What does that mean then for the common Mwananchi? Because this is where they're getting access to capital. This is where they're getting their loans. Couple that to that 14% cap.
You're right. I mean, the ordinary Mwananchi, first of all, will say they've never relied on banks to get loans. That's the one thing they'll tell you. They'll tell you they've got loans from chamas, they've got the loans from SACCOs. So a lot of people say the ordinary Mwananchi has always been neglected by the mainstream banking sector. Right. Barring maybe the equities of this world that came to do that. But that said, small businesses, SMEs, that used to get credit from banks, sometimes at 24%, 23%, now cannot access that credit at 14%. because it's not worthwhile for the banks to lend at 14%, especially when they can get the same 14% from government paper, treasury bills, bonds. So why would you want to lend a risky enterprise 14% when you can get a risk-free government at 14%? So I think that made SMEs be starved of cash, and that's the reason you're seeing retail spending taking a beating. Malls are not doing very well because the money supply in the economy is growing at 2%, which is the slowest that it's ever grown in a decade. Normally, you expect money supply to grow at about 20%. So it's people are hurting, people are feeling the credit crunch, and I think a lot of people had hoped that Friday would bring closure and take us back to business. So I think the challenge is extending this political season a bit longer. It might still damage business prospects for the short term, but I think for the long term, it's going to be a good story for the country.
Now, like you rightly mentioned, not many Kenyans are big on investing in the stock market. We're more, we're bigger off on land issues and whatnot. But are there changes in the economy right now likely to trickle down to the ground in terms of changes in the prices of basic commodities, especially because that's what the Kenyans want to know. Am I going to pay 100 shillings more for unga, and how will that happen? Is that likely to happen?
If you look at the typical Kenyan, let me tell you, investments is about psychology, first of all. Many times as financial experts, we like to think that people go for investments with the highest returns, but that's not always the case. There's a reason people appreciate land sometimes more than stocks, when sometimes stocks might even give you better returns because there's an emotional attachment to it, there's a psychological attachment to it. That's not going to change. That's what you call the risk profile of your typical Kenyan investor, and you can never change that. In terms of looking at the cost of goods and commodities, will that change how people view how they want to spend their money? Possibly. If somebody wanted to get into agribusiness and he saw possibly the price of onions or tomatoes is going up, then definitely they are going to plant more tomatoes and more onions because they know they'll get a better return. So people are slowly starting to understand what are the economic dynamics and how do I take advantage of that. And especially in the counties, that's another area people are not looking at. Devolution has been a big story. People are realizing you do not have to invest in Nairobi alone. The counties are providing fresh new opportunities for young people to go and put in the investments and get returns. So I think net, these new developments are going to be extremely beneficial.
But elections are an expensive affair. I mean, the August 8th polls, one of the most expensive in the continent's history. I mean, I believe even in the world. So we're having a repeat election only for the presidential election, but it's likely to cost the country more money. And this is a country that is already reeling in massive public debt. We have a public wage accounting for more than 50% of the total GDP. How do we begin recovering from this? Because initially we've seen massive infrastructure development in this country over the last 5 years, but that hasn't quite trickled down to the common mwananchi just yet. What could be happening there?
Well, democracy is expensive. If our country chooses they want to go down the democratic path and have big independent institutions, it's an expensive path because it means you can have an election, spend billions in it, and that election is nullified, then have another election. So what I think I saw what the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury is going to do is just going to cut from other areas, going to have some austerity measures in areas that were maybe not absolutely necessary for 2017 and use some of that money for the election in October 17th. So you really have to adjust with the times, and Kenyans have spoken loudly that they want a democratic Kenya. So we have no other choice but to make sure that our budgets align to that. Maybe in the future budgets, they need to have provisions for second or even third elections, in 1 year, because you never know how long these nullifications could go on. So you're right. I think the budgeting cycle needs to be a bit more broader. It needs to be a bit more smarter. It needs to anticipate things like this. But I think it's still a fantastic thing because if you look at, we have 54 countries in Africa. How many countries are having this kind of conversation today? I'd say none. So we're still in a very, very unique post in Kenya.
All right. So, of course, uncertainties, in the economy, especially in the stock market, the trading of the shilling, are unavoidable, so to speak. But like you mentioned, 75% of investors in the Kenyan stock market are foreigners, very few being Kenyan. But then this opportunity does offer a window for Kenyans willing to take a risk to then invest in this stock market. What challenges, however, lie therein for whoever will be willing to invest right now?
I think for most Kenyans, they say there's a knowledge gap. A lot of Kenyans will tell you, I want to buy Safaricom stocks, I want to buy equity stocks, but how do I go about it? What is a CDS account? Who advises me on what stocks to buy, what stocks to sell? And so those are some of the things that we as Mentoria do in terms of providing what we call advisory services to clientele, because you're right, not everybody has the access to internet, access to information, access to that kind of finesse. So that's why a lot of people just walk out. So that's one. Number two is just an open-minded sort of like situation. As we said, a lot of people have grown up knowing you put money in land or in farming. So changing those mindsets and being able to be exposed to new ideas, that's a personal decision that you really can't impose on anybody. So I think those two things, if the Capital Markets Authority, if stockbrokers are able to endear that to the greater population, we'll see a lot more people investing in.
Right. Now, we've touched on this slightly, but we trade largely with our East African partners, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi as well, within the short term, because there's a lot of optimism for the long-term effects of this ruling. But in the short term, what are the likely scenarios we're likely to witness in terms of economy? How are they going to be impacted by the Supreme Court ruling?
Well, one development that came up in the last one quarter is Pakistan overtook Tanzania and Uganda to be our biggest trading partner. But you're right, Uganda and Tanzania have been largely the main trading partners for Kenya. I don't think, Uganda is landlocked, for example. That's not going to change, whether there's a Supreme Court ruling or not. They still need goods to come through Mombasa, Nairobi, Eldoret, into Kampala. So that's not going to change in the short run. What might affect is in the long run, when they start doing long-term contracts and they say in 2022, okay, this happened in 2017. Could this happen again in 2022? So in the short run, I don't think any contracts will be nullified. I don't think there'll be any rapid changes. It'll be a wait and see. But I think in the people will have now a long-term view that in Kenya, anything can happen. So as you put together your trade agreements, you should always know what we read about the Brexit of this world could happen in Kenya. So price that within your contract. So I think those are going to be more long-term questions.
There are many who talk about, and I've seen this a lot from our viewers on Twitter, asking, is there any possibility that we could be heading to a Zimbabwe situation where we have cash flow issues within this election? Because there are those who say we will have a poll in the next 41 days, one whose outcome could also be contested at the Supreme Court, and we hope that is not the situation. But if that continues, of course, we'll have a prolonged period of uncertainty in the country. Is that a possibility at all?
I think anybody who says that doesn't fully understand where Zimbabwe came from, what caused the challenges in Zimbabwe, and how is that different from Kenya. Zimbabwe's challenges began in the early 2000s when the white farmers were being expelled and there was a whole land reclaiming agenda. None of that is happening in Kenya. So to even make a comparison between the two, yes, both of them were former British colonies with big settler population. Yeah, that's common, but Zimbabwe's political economy has been unique, very unique, in a way that Kenya has not been. So I don't think it's fair to even draw any comparison between the two countries. Of course, they've had cash flow issues. Now they have a Zimbabwean dollar. We are not going that direction. We have a very capable Central Bank of Kenya with a very capable leadership, and we don't have cash flow issues. In fact, if anything, we are raising the caps to even reduce the amount of money that's going in there. So I don't think it's a valid comparison.
Right. So that's more short term. Let's focus on this optimism that most economists have had for the long-term impact of the Supreme Court ruling. What are the possible scenarios you are seeing that are likely to bring a boom in the Kenyan economy?
Well, first of all, we have to look at what is it already that brings a boom to the Kenyan economy. And number one is we have a very young labor force. 65% of this country is below 35 years. access to internet, access to education, masters, PhDs. Number two, we have a very diversified economy. We don't rely on gold like South Africa or oil like Nigeria. And number three is we have a strong constitution. So I think those are the things that are going to be propellers, because if you put those three together and ask where else are you going to get those three in Africa, it's not Morocco, it's not South Africa, it's in Kenya. And that's the reason FDI has gone up in East Africa more so, while in other parts of Africa, in West Africa, it's gone down. In South Africa, it's even gone down. So I think so we can't lose sight of that. Yeah.
All right, so let's focus on, because as you mentioned, this is a gap of information, which you said Kenyans do not quite know, the newest, the latest, the most secure ways of investing. We're mostly focusing on land. How then do we raise such awareness, especially after this rather volatile period, to have more Kenyans in the stock market, more Kenyans investing in bonds and any other type of investments that may be foreign to Kenyans, but largely available and accessible to them?
Well, it goes two ways. Kenyans must make a choice that they want to diversify the portfolio.
Right.
They want to go beyond the normal traditional investments. And that's something only Kenyans can decide for themselves. That's the demand side. In the supply side, obviously, companies, stockbrokers, the Capital Markets Authority, the government, there's so many entities in the government that talk about investments, can invest.
Right.
They can create public forums for people to participate and for people to learn. The media, for example, here can provide avenues for people to understand what is an equity, what is a stock market.
Right.
So I think this very kind of conversation in itself is already boosting knowledge. It's already reducing that information asymmetry that we see out there. So already things are happening. It's not that nothing is happening, but you're right. Are we reaching people in Mandera, in Wajir, in Mombasa, in Kisumu? Are we? That's the question that government agencies in need to think through. Yeah.
Right. Now, following that Supreme Court ruling, there are a section of Kenyans who are largely opposed to that ruling, not because of their political affiliation, but because they say, we survive on small businesses.
Right.
We own small businesses, which have suffered a major blow, during this entire political period. And then we have an extended campaign period. As it stands, these shops and restaurants which remain closed in some region. And like you mentioned earlier, most of these people do not get access to capital from the major banks. How do these small business owners now begin coming back from this seeming slump in their economy?
No, I do feel for them. And to be honest, since January, business has taken quite a beating because it's been campaign season from even as far back as last year.
Right.
So we've already lost 8 months in August. And I do feel for those small businesses that now have to extend another 3 months, but I think this is a perfect time to build a strategy. I think what happens in a business, there's what you call internal housekeeping. And internal housekeeping activities, you do them when business is poor. This is, you look at your strategies, you look at your marketing, you look at your product, so that when the market is ready, when the election season is over, now you hit the ground running. So I think companies that don't have time to build good strategies, this is the golden opportunity because there's not much happening, But a lot of companies are just not doing much in terms of strategy building, so that when you hit October, November, you hit the ground running. So it's a perfect time for soul searching, for reflection, to make internal changes, So I think it's not something that should be looked at as a complete waste. It's providing a fantastic time for introspection, which a lot of businesses do not have time for because of the normal wear and tear of ordinary business.
Yeah. And of course, after this election, after the winner has been declared, we expect that even our leaders will hit the ground running. We already have Parliament with parliamentarians already having been sworn in. As a stakeholder in this sector, are you expecting any major policy changes, that are likely to better the country's economy?
No, absolutely. I don't know why we are so obsessed with the national politics when devolution has created fantastic opportunities at the counties. All the governors have been sworn in. All of them have a flagship project which they want to launch in the first 100 days. So when people say that there's nothing happening in Kenya because of politics, yes, at the national level, but if you go to the counties, a lot of a lot of work is happening already in terms of getting the staffing right, whether that's being done legitimately or not. That's a whole different scenario. But in terms of having a strategy, at least for the first 100 days, because if you don't have a flagship project, if you don't have a 5-year strategy, it means you're really wasting the people's past, people's money. So I think there's so much happening. I think in Kenya we are so focused on the national level, we forget that there's actually real developments happening at the county level. And I think that's what we really we need to strive to really have conversations about, because there's nothing limiting county governments from executing. They have been sworn in, they have the full mandate. There's no petition, so I think it's business. It should business, and I think in the long term, what's going to happen to Kenya is we're going to decouple politics from business.
Right.
People are going to say, you know, politics has its normal course, but business in Kenya will not always be influenced by politics, and that kind of decoupling, it pays a certain dividends to an economy, because it means, like in the United States, it doesn't matter if the Democrats or the Republicans win, you know, your investment in IT or whatever, investments in agribusiness is going to reap benefits. So I think if that's the direction we are going to go, I think it's fantastic for business.
All right, so this is the second term of devolution, and the main aim of that was to decentralize or to dissolve or to devolve resources to the various counties. But again, even, you know, taking a stock of the last 5 years, most of the counties that have utilized their resources somewhat to a good extent only have infrastructure developments to boast about. When it goes down to the ground, it hasn't quite reflected to the common mwananchi just yet. How do we start exploiting devolution to ensure it means more money in the pockets of the people?
Well, it starts with information. A lot of people, especially in Nairobi, don't take time to know in their home counties who their deputy governors are. If I ask you, who's your deputy governor?
I honestly would not be able to tell who the Taita deputy governor is today. I do know she's female.
Exactly. So a lot of people, yes, they might know the governor, they might know the senator, but they don't take time to know the county assembly, who's the minister for education, minister for health, what are the policies that the minister for education and health are going to roll out. So there's still some lethargy. People still are still not very curious about what's happening. But if you're very curious, at Mentoria we publish reports on what's happening in the counties. Kwale, for example, signed a 300 million shilling contract with the Chinese to build some roads. You know, in Kajiado, this dramatic stuff happening. In Mandera, they had their first cesarean section. The healthcare there is really developing. But I think it's just been, after 50 years of national government, I think our psyche is said to whatever happens in Nairobi, till to the fact that we don't really understand there are major juicy opportunities happening at the counties, but you just have to make some effort. You have to know who's in charge of what. You have to approach them. We have the Council of Governors here in Nairobi with a fantastic secretariat full of information. I mean, sometimes I think they have more information than the public ever cares to go through. So I think to challenge Kenyans, we need to be a bit more proactive. Yes, we need to understand the national picture, but we need to really think through, in our home counties, what can we do in terms to tap investment? And that's where I think the next 5 years is going to go.
Mostly focus on. Let's focus on those who want to widen, even as we wind up, those who want to widen their scope of trade, and those who want to trade, you know, with partners in Tanzania, partners in Uganda. And just before the election, we had the East African Legislative Assembly sitting, ironing out a few issues. As a stakeholder, do you feel that the East African community has put in place the correct structures to ensure that there is seamless trading among the East African community members?
I think it's a case of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. When they have the East African meetings, the extraordinary meetings, there's always a lot of unanimity in terms of we need to go forward together. But if you read through the fine print, especially Kenya and Tanzania, you see sometimes the trade barriers are escalating, you know, and sometimes making it harder to trade. So there are definitely local politics playing in Tanzania, in Kenya, even in Uganda. But I think net, a lot of people, we're heading towards an East African passport. You know, there's a huge push towards an East African currency in 2022. So it's a case of it's a slow but steady pace. I don't think the East African currency will happen in 2022, but people are saying we are heading in that direction. Right.
And Ken, finally, your closing thoughts. Your expectations, because there's 41 days to this poll, your expectations on how the economy is going to behave for the next 40 days?
I think our business will decouple.
Well, let's actually make it 45 because 45 the actual days. Decision really is what counts.
I think, and I'm going to write a paper on this, we're going to experience what they call the decoupling dividends, where business now will break away from the political cycle, which I think is a very healthy thing. And business planning will continue. I think people will still continue to invest. We have about 13 hotels that are planning to enter the Kenyan market. Those ones are not changing their plans. We are going to have more factories coming in. So I think it's going to be a healthy time for Kenya because people will say politics can continue parallel, but we still need to make money. We still need to put food on our table. So I think we'll see a lot more people, unlike in the past, holding out their decisions. I think a lot more people now are going to take a long-term view of Kenya and continue investing. All
right, so let's hope so as we keep an eye on the economy. That is Ken Gichinga, Chief Economist at Mentoria Consulting. Many thanks for joining us on Morning Express. It is now 8 minutes to the top of the hour. We're just about to wind up on your favorite morning show. Let me call it my colleague Michael Gitonga. But a quick reminder of our question of the day, because we were asking you this morning whether you think the IEBC erred in locking out other candidates and ensuring that only President Uhuru Kenyatta and NASA leader Raila Odinga take part in the election to be held within the next 41 days. Let's take a look at some of your comments here. We have Irene Matende Chere saying, I do support this fully. Much time has been wasted and we need to get over these elections already. And we also have the likes of Ogello Jr. saying that Ekuru Court is desperately looking for public attention. Remember, Ekuru Court said that he would this morning dispute that decision at the Supreme Court, so at the court rather, saying it is his constitutional right to take part in this election. Any more responses, Mike?
Yes, Washira Gitai says no need to add candidates who only compete with spoiled votes. We have quite a number of responses actually. We have Hebson Nyaramba saying no, willing candidates should be allowed to participate. Let me just see if we can fish out a few more. Ogello Jr. says, I support that. Even if the other candidates were allowed to contest, the race will still be a two-horse race. So,
right, so we have Mtuetu here saying, if that's what a previous court ruling said, what are you asking us about? Well, Mtuetu, the IEBC has decided that it will only be Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga in this election, and that is why we are asking you, do you agree with that decision? Because it is a constitutional right for all the presidential candidates to take place. But Omari Abraham says, IEBC are running around like a headless chicken. It is not a rerun, it was a botched election.
All right, and quite a number of responses also regarding the political point this morning. I have Stephen Wambua. Remember, we had two members of the legislature here, one senator and a member of parliament from Mathare, and basically was discussing whether IEBC is ready to conduct the polls on the 17th. And we have Stephen Wambua, who says it's not logical for IEBC to announce the dates for the new election before receiving a full ruling. So, of course, we're wondering whether they are actually going to be ready. And we have Pieces of Beautiful. Wow, interesting name there. Yes, in a constructive manner, not destructive, as Jubilee is currently doing. What a shame. We also have, let me see, we have a gentleman here. No, Beth Ida, who says Jubilee would have been enjoying the president's seat. Would have been enjoying, sorry, the president's seat only if IEBC did its job.
All right, so do keep the conversation going on social media. The hashtag is Morning Express KTN. Many thanks for giving us your thoughts and views. We've come to a close on this show. Many thanks for being with us for the past 4 hours as well. My name is Michelle Ngele. See you tomorrow, same time, same place.
My name is Michael Gitonga. Thank you for keeping us company throughout the 4 hours. And we're going to hand over the reins now to Betty Kialo for more news and reviews. So do have yourselves a great day. God bless.